Everyone, so we have a special guest speaker today, Jason Blessing. Some of you know Jason from your sections, and if not, we'll get a chance to learn about what Jason's research interests in cybersecurity and international relations. So I'm going to turn it over to Jason, and we'll get started.
All right. Everybody hear me all right? Those of you in my section know that I don't necessarily need help being loud, but just make sure everybody can hear me. So today we'll talk a little bit about cybersecurity and international relations, and this is an area where a lot of my research focuses, particularly right now. So we'll dive into some of the issues with this field that's really come about in the last 5 years or so. So, before we dive in, let's just think for a second. When you guys hear of cyber attacks in the news, or you think of cyber threats or hackers, who do you normally think of? Let's have a show of hands. Who thinks of the picture on the left? Okay, so most everybody. Who thinks about the picture on the right? Okay, well, second group is actually more accurate. The media has really played up the image of the hacker and the image of the cyber threats, when in reality, states and non-state actors generally arrange their cyber forces, for lack of a better term, in office parks. Criminal organizations use the exact same setup as states. So, sort of fun. But here's what we're going to be getting into today. Here's our agenda. First, we're going to dive in and really think about some of the conceptual apparatus, lay a foundation for how we can think about this as an issue in IR. So we necessarily need to get through some of the conceptual stuff first, right? Then we'll talk about how the technical realities of cyberspace, how this has really led to the rise and a greater impact of non-state actors. Then we'll come back and grapple with a dynamic we've been talking a lot about throughout the course, and this is relations between states. And in particular, what does cyber conflict between states look like? How can we think about this? And then finally, we'll sum up and just look ahead to what we'll be doing next week. So, first, what is cyberspace? We need to look, what exactly are we talking about, right? Normally when we're thinking about international relations, we're focused solely on what's happening in the physical world, right? But cyberspace is different. Cyberspace is both physical and digital. And it's not just the internet. That's probably the most popular conception, is the internet is cyberspace. Actually, it's just one part. Cyberspace has really 4 components. The first, we need to think about the infrastructure of cyberspace. So this is the first facet or first layer. The physical infrastructure, so things like cables that are underwater that allow states to access the internet across the world. Also, your computer, your phone that's connected to the internet. This is all part of the physical infrastructure of cyberspace. Routers for corporate systems, all connected as part of cyberspace. The second component is the logical layer. We can think of this in terms of sort of the programming, the building blocks, right? The physical aspect of cyberspace doesn't mean much unless we have these logical programming building blocks to actually enable the digital services that we access in cyberspace. And so this is where the internet comes into play, right? We have things like the internet, different software packages, platforms on which websites are based. This is the second layer of cyberspace. The third major layer is the information layer. This is what we're most used to, I think. Even casual users of internet, cyberspace, this is what we think of, right? It's the information content that's stored, transmitted, manipulated, transformed on the internet, for example. So we think of things like web content, think of things like your Facebook posts, the tweet you read this morning, the tweet sent out last night, any of the information that's actually transmitted across cyberspace. And then finally, probably the most overlooked part of cyberspace, the users, you, me, everybody that interacts with this physical digital domain, right? And it's important to remember we all have different interests, we all have different purposes for accessing cyberspace, different motivations, different roles. So this is what cyberspace is. It's not purely just the internet. It's really 4 distinct components, 4 distinct layers that are all related. So the natural question that we need to think about in progressing towards thinking about grappling with cyberspace and IR, well, how can an actor, whether it's you, me, a state, a terrorist organization, how can we actually control these different parts of cyberspace? Well, conquest, for lack of a better term, conquest or control over these different layers, they look different. So, for example, if we think about the information layer, this entails the successful control or manipulation of information. A good example would be website defacement, right? When a couple years back, mid-2000s, the US sent an envoy to Syria, the objectives were opposed by the Free Syrian Army, a non-state actor online, who defaced US Department of State website. That's a manipulation and control of the information. This also involves things like misinformation and disinformation on social media. This is where fake news can come into play. Fake news is a form of conquest in cyberspace. At the logical layer, the more the programming layer, we can think of this as reprogramming how the software works, making the software work the way that you want it to work. You're reconfiguring the rules of operation of a network or of a system. The physical layer, you're actually taking control of physical machinery that relies on these logical building blocks. So this is things like gaining control or access to the power grid, for example. Taking control of physical machine processes within factories. And then finally, with the user layer, conquest or control, you're essentially convincing the user of an alternate reality. This is sort of your matrix scenario, right? If you can convince the user that the program is actually working the way it's supposed to, even though you've changed it, or that the ideas you've inserted into the information space are true, you're conquering the human element of cyberspace. And what's important to realize and to think about is that these last two layers, conquest in particular, you really need to go through one of the other layers. For example, you need to actually conquer the logical building blocks and the programming to be able to control the physical machinery or processes that rely on those building blocks. Similarly, you can convince, as I said, the user that the program's actually working the way it's intended to. We've got a good example of this that has a short video a little later on in the lecture of Stuxnet. We'll see how the users were actually convinced that the program was working the way it was supposed to. And finally, you can also get to the user layer through the information layer. Again, this is what we're experiencing with fake news and a good example, Russian troll farms who are really employed either by the government or by a non-state actor to insert fake social media posts to try and convince users of an alternate reality. So it's a little more complicated than purely just conquering land. Cyberspace has different ways we can go about conquest. So okay, we're talking about conquest, we're talking about what cyberspace is, but how do we think about what is power in cyberspace, right? Normally we think of power in a purely material sense in international relations. And by purely material, it's the things we've already been talking about, right? These are things like military power. How many tanks do you have? How many guns do I have? How many nuclear weapons do I have? The material aspect of power. We've also been talking about, in the trade section, how much money do I have? How much economic wealth how much influence can I buy with wealth? And also things like population. You know, how many people do you have in your state that could, in wartime, be converted into soldiers? Well, that's not necessarily the case with cyberspace, right? Cyberspace, power's primarily digital. We talked about conquest on the last slide. Most of this occurs in the digital space, in the digital realm. So how do we think about something that's both material, it has material implications as well. Power isn't only material, but it's also digital. How do we think about this? This is a problem for a lot of IR scholars. So our buddy Joe Nye, in his book, The Future of Power from 2011, he gives us a way that we can at least definitionally conceptualize cyber power. And in the literature, everybody tends to put cyber in front of everything, so it's a little bit overkill, so bear with me. But cyber power, Nye says that cyber power, if we want to think about this, it's the set of resources that relate to the creation, the control, and the communication of electronic and computer-based information. So we've got the creation, control, and communication. So necessarily this has some material component, right? You have to have the infrastructure to be able to do this. You also have to have the technical proficiency. That leads us really to think about the more nuanced dynamics of cyber power. And we won't dive into everything specifically, but there are two aspects that I want to point out that are extremely important, and probably the most important factors in determining how much cyber power an actor has. Well, these are, one, how technologically sophisticated are you? What's your hardware look like? What's your digital platforms look like? How secure is your network? How well do you know your network? Technological sophistication is sort of the foundation, right? And we're used to thinking about this. We'll come back to Jervis in a little bit, but remember, Jervis says one of the components of power, and particularly determining the offense-defense balance, is technological power. Well, that's where the part of this factors into cyberspace. But we also need to think about, okay, how proficient, how good are you at actually using these resources? We have to think about the human skill and the human capital behind these technological advancements. They really don't mean much of anything unless you can actually use them and use them effectively. And if we think about how cyber power is used or exercised, well, it's not necessarily the same as launching a missile, right? All of this, again, this all occurs in the material world, the world that we're used to thinking of in international relations. Cyber power is used through digital weapons, or cyber instruments, as Nye calls them. And we've got a lot of examples of these. We've got malware, we've got malicious code, we have things like Trojan viruses that infect computer systems. We've also got distributed denial of service attacks coming from several computers to overload servers, crash web content. Also have advanced persistent threats, sort of these worms that keep self-replicating and keep persisting in a computer system, keeps changing. And we've also got other things like logic bombs, botnet servers that launch these DDoS attacks. The details aren't really important, but the important takeaway is these aren't the weapons that we're used to thinking about in international relations. These aren't necessarily materially based. They're digital in nature. So if we zoom back out and if we think about the goals of cyber power, it looks pretty similar to a lot of the goals we've been talking about, right? So mostly because, remember, we're all rational, self-interested states or rational, self-interested actors, we want to obtain our preferred outcomes. Seems reasonable. But with cyberspace, we have to think in two dimensions. One is we need to think about, okay, what are the operational goals? What are we trying to accomplish in cyberspace? Mostly this takes the form of compromising information security pillars. And the three pillars are integrity, confidentiality, and availability of information. We can also, control computing systems, trick the users. These are all intra-cyber goals, right? These are all the goals we're worried about at the operational level. But we also need to think about what we're more used to thinking about is, okay, the strategic implications of cyber power. How do we get our preferred goals outside of cyberspace? Well, we can try and change government behavior through coercion. Our good friend Schelling talks about offense, defense, compellence, deterrence. These are all goals outside of cyberspace. We can also use it as a form of swaggering, just to be able to show that you can hack into someone's system to flex your muscles, show them how much cyber power you have. You can also use it as a form of protest if there's a decision you don't like. So it's helpful to think about the goals of cyber power sort of within our framework of coercion, but we also need to remember that, okay, there's these intra-cyber goals, these operational goals as well. So this is sort of the scaffolding and the conceptual building that we're doing to get to the rest of the lecture. We've got cyberspace, 4 distinct layers: information, the logical layer of building blocks, the physical layer, and we've got the human layer. Now he gives us an interesting way to think about this with cyber power. Try and shape this really difficult subject so that it's easier to put into play in international relations. So any questions about sort of the conceptual stuff? Well, good to go. Taking a journey through cyberspace. Okay. So next, we've got sort of these technical ideas with us. Let's look at the impact of non-state actors. Why are they so important in cyberspace? Well, cyberspace is kind of problematic for IR scholars. There's a reason that only a few, just a handful of people even dive into the subject, right? It can be frustrating. And there are really 3 major issues that we'll talk about that IR scholars have a really hard time with. The first, we've sort of already alluded to, right? We're used to talking about power. Usually the more power, the safer you are, right? More military power you have, the more you can defend your territory, the more you can repel adversaries. However, in cyberspace, usually the stronger states, the stronger actors, the actors with more cyber power, they also tend to be much more vulnerable to attack. This is what one of my colleagues calls the capability-vulnerability paradox. It's a bit of a paradox. You want to increase your cyber power, but that necessarily entails more vulnerabilities. The second is the government is a distinct actor, right? We've been used to thinking about the government as, for instance, a rational unitary actor. The state is a unitary actor. We've also talked about the state as a distinct actor for domestic politics, right? Lobbying groups vie against each other and try to exert pressure on the state as an independent actor. And international relations usually takes the state or the government as a distinct analytical concept, right? We kind of tease it out to make things a little more easier to think about, and for the most part, it holds up. However, cyberspace, the connected realities, make it a little more difficult for IR scholars. The state and society are largely dependent on the same connections, the same infrastructure as society. State and society are dependent upon the same connections. So it's a lot harder to parse out the state from the rest of society. This is problematic, right? We've been talking about how the state's a distinct actor. Not so in cyberspace. And then finally, there's a high degree of anonymity in cyberspace. Attribution for an attack is a lot harder than asking, where did this missile come from? Who fired it? Who launched a nuclear weapon? With all of these things, you have physical signatures that you can trace back to the attacker. In cyberspace, it's very easy to cover your tracks. Attribution for an attack is extremely difficult when compared to traditional forms of attack. So because of this, and because states and societies are dependent on the same networks, it's really hard to distinguish who's a legal combatant versus who's a legal non-combatant. The issue here is who's working for someone's Department of Defense or Ministry of Defense? Who's working for someone's military versus who's sitting at home on their computer attacking military networks for fun? It's hard to tell the difference. Actors can effectively raise false flags, and mask the origin of an attack. So what these three problems that IR has in thinking about cyberspace, the reality is that the traditional power gap that we think about between the state and non-state actors, this gap is reduced, right? We're used to talking about, well, the state has a monopoly on the use of force, or on the use of violence. Well, a monopoly on the ability to attack in cyberspace, the government doesn't fully have that monopoly. And so what we see, and this is true for a number of reasons, right? As I said, states with greater capabilities are generally more vulnerable. Well, why? States with more cyber capabilities have more resources. They're more connected, right? The more power you have, well, that necessarily rests on a greater technological sprawl. However, this high degree of connectedness has two implications. One, because you have larger networks, you have more opportunities for someone to attack them. There are more potential targets for an attack. Second, because you have more networks, that's going to mean that your society is more interconnected. That means non-state actors have the ability to get on the internet much easier. It's going to be a lot easier for someone in American society to connect to the internet because the country is so sprawling with internet infrastructure and cyberspace infrastructure than it is for someone in North Korea. And there are low entry costs, right? Compared to, let's think about this. If an individual wants to get engaged in traditional warfare, well, you can go and buy guns that's not going to be as effective against another state's military. You could try and buy a tank, but unless you're Arnold Schwarzenegger, that's going to be really expensive. I hope some of you know the reference. Arnold Schwarzenegger has his own channel on YouTube where he smashes things with tanks, and it's amazing. I highly recommend everyone watches it. But if you want to get an airplane, it's hard, right? It's expensive. There's a lot of legwork, a lot of startup costs. That's not the case for cyberspace. Unless maybe you're with Comcast and, they hike up the rates every year. But it's pretty cheap for an individual to access cyberspace. So, non-state actors play a much bigger role than we're used to thinking about. Right, we talked last week about terrorism and asymmetric warfare and non-state actors trying to close the gap by using asymmetric warfare, this power gap. Well, it's a lot easier to do that in cyberspace. The government has more vulnerabilities, and it's cheaper for you to exploit those vulnerabilities as a non-state actor. So if we think about non-state actors in the cyber domain, there's really two types of actors that we're worried about. The first is non-state actors with highly structured networks. So these are groups that have more hierarchical relations within the group. They have more cohesive rules of operation, more cohesive branding. And what are we talking about? We're talking about actors like multinational corporations, terrorist groups, and organized crime or criminal organizations, criminal syndicates. These are all very organized actors. The other type of actor that we're generally worried about or care about in cyberspace are individuals within more lightly structured networks, so that we don't have these hierarchical relationships. The rules of membership are less clear. And we have groups such as transnational advocacy networks that we've talked about, social movements. We also have protesters at large, online coordination of protests. The next slide we'll see an example of how this can play out. And hacktivist groups, hacker activists, groups that coordinate online, such as Anonymous. So these are the two that we really care about. And we can see, with a bit of a case study, we can see how these actors are wildly important, how they can almost level the playing field to some degree, right? So, let's take a look at Estonia. Estonia, way up there in the Baltics. Traditionally, in Russia's sphere of influence, they were part of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, gained their independence in 1991. Ever since then, they have decided to take it upon themselves. Their thing was going to be the internet. They have become the most cyber advanced and most cyber dependent country in the world. More than the United States, more than China, more than Russia, more than the UK. Estonia is the most connected country in the world. They have free public Wi-Fi, for example, everywhere. But they've moved out of the Russian sphere of influence. In 2004, they joined the EU, and they joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. As a process, particularly bleeding into the 2000s, they underwent a process of de-Sovietization, removing any Soviet icons from the state. And part of this, after an election in 2007, was a decision to remove the Bronze Soldier of Tallinn. This was a Soviet-era statue commemorating the Soviet defeat of the Nazis in World War II. It stood in the main square of Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. Well, as soon as the decision was released, this was wildly unpopular with A, the Russian government, but B, a substantial portion of the Russian ethnics in Estonia. So, this is the Bronze Soldier of Tallinn, by the way. Very looming statue. It was moved, and when it was first removed, we witnessed all sorts of protests the night after the decision. And these are referred to as the Bronze Night protests. These Russian ethnic minorities took to the street and protested, burning flags, causing widespread vandalism, protesting the decision. However, this only lasted one night. So why is this case so important? Well, what followed was 2 weeks worth of widespread cyber attacks. About April 27th, the attacks really came in 3 waves. The first wave consisted of just pings to government servers requesting access, traffic requests to government servers. The second wave was more sophisticated, more coordinated, with a little bit of help from the Kremlin and the Russian government directing some things. But these online protesters in the first wave were just copying and pasting code and sending requests to government servers. This knocked government servers offline. And additionally, when we get to the more widespread distributed denial of service attacks, where we have large networks of computers purchased on the black market, access to these computers from the United States that had been taken over remotely, computers from Egypt that had been taken over remotely, sending requests for traffic to Estonia's government servers, knocked those offline. They were rolling blackouts for about 2 weeks, knocked out the 3 largest media conglomerates in Estonia, rolling blackouts for 2 weeks. Rolling internet blackouts for most of Estonian society were knocked offline for the majority of 2 weeks. And Hansa Bank, which is now Swedbank, the second largest bank in the Baltics at the time, they were also targeted. And for about 3 days, customers could not access their online accounts, and they could not get money from the ATM. So, long story short, the Estonian government responded with their computer emergency response team, essentially pulled the plug on the internet, put defense measures in place, and the attacks subsided in the middle of May. But the important thing of this is this was the first international attack against a state in cyberspace, right? This is crazy. This was something you could only think of in movies until it actually happened. And non-state actors played a huge role in knocking government services offline. And as a result, this incident has been dubbed Web War I, and it sort of sparked the fear that cyber war is the war of the future, taking complete societies offline, these societies that are dependent upon the internet and upon cyber connections. So we can see that non-state actors play a much bigger role here than we're used to thinking about. So we'll stop and pause for a second. Yeah, Justin.
So what I was wondering is, you said that, the more connected a state is, the more, you said damage that because or more powerful they are. But like, what's like the definition of power? Because you could like say, for example, one person could like hack an like a nuclear power plant and cause a meltdown and kill millions of people. Like that's pretty powerful, and that only needs one person.
So exactly, and this is why Nye's definition is just the start. There are some colleagues that I have at the Naval War College that are working on this logic of effects-based power, right? What's the effect produced from cyberspace, from a cyber attack? Trying to refine the conception of the conception of power in cyberspace. So to answer your question, nobody has a really good answer for that. But there are people working on that, and that's part of the dynamic that's coming into play. Good question. What else? Any other questions? Yeah, Jay.
So speaking of actors in cybersecurity, I was wondering if the development of artificial intelligence would complicate the current situation, because, like for example, machine learning, computers can learn stuff by themselves from data without being programmed. So I was wondering, maybe in the future, machines can start, I don't know, cyber war by themselves.
So right now the big issue with artificial intelligence, with AI, is that it improves the ability of an attacker to make a dent on the network security. So because AI is wrapped up in part of these viruses and these worms and all the code that's being deployed against, for example, a state's network system, it enhances the self-replicability and the transformation of that virus so that it doesn't get caught and helps clean its tracks. But the same can be said, AI is also helping states sort of run routine checkups on their systems. So it's making things move a lot faster. And whether we don't quite know the impact yet. Good question. Yeah?
If this is so effective, why is it not more commonly used, or why do we not know about more issues like Estonia? Are defenses risen, or is the ability not quite there?
Well, it's an interesting dynamic, and it's one I'm actually looking at in my own work, is why hasn't there been more attacks? How are states looking at cyberspace as a domain? The main answer really is fear. There's a fear of escalation because this technology, states are pretty slow to adapt to a lot of things. Bureaucracy kind of slows you down. So with new issues that emerge like this, particularly with what policymakers see as near unlimited potential for cyber attacks to access the grid, access all of society, and basically pull the plug on an adversary, there's fear that leads to restraint. And I'll sort of address this later on. Some organizations and states have been leading the charge with cyber norms to try and make states internalize this restraint. So, good question. It's one I hope to find a good answer for. Any other questions? Yeah.
I don't know quite how to word this, but how would you, we talked about actors with highly structured networks and other structured networks. How would you define, could you say an attack could be like what's happening with like Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and obtaining consumers' data, like almost like violating their privacy policies? Like, would you consider that an attack as well, or is it more just like malicious based?
More malicious intent based, that's also harder to prove. But the issue with Facebook right now, it seems, in Cambridge Analytica is it's a legal regulation issue, right? The regulations haven't caught up to the digital realities. And we're seeing this, essentially corporations are making regulation as they go because the government doesn't necessarily have it in place yet. So, good question. Yeah, nice question.
Kind of along those same lines, like data breaches where like credit card information
Yes.
is like from like Target, for example. Like, is that like kind of like a cyber attack thing that like could be used?
So, and this is a very good question because it sort of gets at the logic which we'll be discussing next. It's a network intrusion. The purpose is different, or the intent is different because it's cybercrime, right? The compromise a couple years ago, when I was still in finance, I was dealing with the Target compromise basically every day for 3 months. But it's cybercrime. But the issue is that it looks the same as another network intrusion that could be very malicious. So that's actually a really good segue to talking about cyber conflict between states. So when we talk about states in cyberspace, they've got a ton of things to do. We've already touched on some of this. They have to deal with espionage, regulation of domestic connections, regulation of the private sector, their own network security. We've also seen that it's really easy for non-state actors to exploit the state. We've already gone through the logic of vulnerability there, right? More connections, more power, but also more vulnerability. It's a double-edged sword. But we have to remember that power diffusion is not power equality. Just because some of cyber non-state actors can obtain a lot of cyber power doesn't mean they're actually going to completely close the gap with states. States and their militaries are still the strongest actors in cyberspace. They're still the ones with the most impact. And because of this, the fear of cyber war between states looms very large in the background. And we'll talk about this. So if we think about what cyber conflict between states is, or what it looks like, really it's just old wine in new bottles. There's not much that's different about it. States still undertake espionage. They try to influence through propaganda. That's nothing new, right? Cyberspace just offers a new way to do this, a new domain where this can take place. As a result, most of the cyber operations between states tend to be sort of these low-level incursions, espionage, the information operations, trying to control what the military calls control the information space. You're trying to shape the flow and the availability of information, what your adversary gets. A contemporary example that fits into this logic is Russian meddling in the US 2006 election, right? No clear strategic outcome other than Putin wanting to sneakily be happy here, gaining influence for hopefully longer term, more strategic goals that aren't directly related to the presidency. This isn't really anything new. It's just an information operation happening in a new domain. But the problem is that some states have stepped outside of this low-level activity and have more high-level, impactful, direct attacks on military and defense networks. And one of the most cited examples is Stuxnet. This video, a couple minutes, and if it loads like it looks it will, it's about 3.5 minutes, but it gives an excellent overview of what the attack is and why it's a problem and leading to a lot more fear. It happened in about 2012. Well, okay, let's...
In June last year, a computer virus called Stuxnet was discovered lurking in the databanks of power plants, traffic control systems, and factories around the world. 20 times more complex than any previous virus code, it had an array of capabilities. Among them, the ability to turn up the pressure inside nuclear reactors or switch off oil pipelines, and Stuxnet could tell the system operators everything was normal. Unlike most viruses, Stuxnet doesn't carry the usual forged security clearance that helps viruses burrow into systems. It actually had a real clearance, stolen from one of the most reputable computer technology companies in the world. It exploited security gaps that system creators are unaware of. These holes are known as 0 days, and the most successful viruses exploit them. The details of a 0 day can be sold on the black market for $100,000. Stuxnet took advantage of 20 0 days. But once it got into a system, it didn't always activate. Buried deep in the Stuxnet code was a specific target. Without that target, the virus remained dormant. What was it looking to shut down? The centrifuges that spin nuclear material at Iran's enrichment facilities. Stuxnet was a weapon. The first to be made entirely out of code. The Washington-based Institute for Science and International Security says the virus may have shut down 1,000 centrifuges at Natanz, Iran's main enrichment facility, last year. In November, the International Atomic Energy Agency the UN's nuclear watchdog, said Iran had suspended work at its nuclear facilities without explaining why. Many observers credited Stuxnet. Last month, the Iranian government conceded the virus's infection of the Bashir nuclear facility, still under construction, meant that switching the plant on could lead to a national electricity blackout. Iran has responded to the attack with an open call for hackers to join the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and has reportedly amassed the second largest online army in the world. So who was behind Stuxnet? There's no evidence beyond rumor. Some have it that Israel is responsible because the virus code apparently contains references to the Hebrew Bible. Others believe the US was involved in the testing and development. The finger has even been pointed at Siemens Mobile Phone Company, whose software is used by the Iranian regime. The most important question may not be who designed it, but who will redesign it. The evolution has been so fast that 9 months after its detection, the first virus that could crash power grids or destroy oil pipelines is available online for anyone to download and tinker with. You can watch people on YouTube pulling Stuxnet apart. It's an open source weapon. And there's no way of knowing who will use it or what they will use it for.
All right, so pretty scary stuff. This is a real example, not something pulled from a movie. The concern is, particularly among states and their policymakers, is cyber war coming? States routinely, they do this all the time. They break into each other's systems to gain information. Not a surprise, we almost expect that. But data tells us, in a lot of empirical studies, particularly a book put out by Valeriano and Manes, they tell us that these types of operations are really rare. We don't really see this much. Operations are usually at a much lower level. Not so much damage, not so much destruction, just probing. So why, then, if these operations are so rare, why is the fear of cyber war so intense? An example of this is from former U.S. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. And in testifying in front of Congress and in interviews, he has routinely stated, well, the fear of multiple cyber attacks at once, coupled with a physical attack, could lead to a cyber Pearl Harbor, take down government infrastructure, take down societal infrastructure, and lead to a new sense of vulnerability, this profound new sense of vulnerability. So why this fear of cyber war? Well, one way to explain the fear of cyber war is through the security dilemma. So just a nice little reminder. Security dilemma, we all know this. It's efforts taken by one state to increase its security could provoke reactions by other states, making everybody else less secure. And really, the fear of cyber war hinges on the general consensus that cyberspace is a doubly dangerous world. Remember Jervis's four worlds theory. Doubly dangerous. Offense has the advantage, and we can't tell the difference between cyber weapons. So quickly, let's just break this down why this might be the case. Well, weapons in cyberspace, offensive and defensive weapons, are the same. They're nearly identical. Both offensive and defensive intrusions appear the same to the defender. They're based on the same types of cyber instruments, the same code that could be used to attack a system or a network can also be used defensively to gain information. Therefore, cyber weapons are largely indistinguishable. It makes offensive and defensive operations appear the exact same. Now, what about offense dominance in cyberspace? Right? Well, like we said, developing malicious code for attack is pretty cheap. It's much better than trying to build your own missile from home or trying to build your own nuclear weapon from scratch. It's just not going to happen for a regular individual. It takes massive state budgets to do these things. Well, copying and pasting code, though, that's pretty simple. We saw it in the Estonian case. It doesn't take much skill either, right? Just right-click, copy-paste. So there's not much skill required for an attack, whereas to fly a plane and drop bombs, you have to be trained for several years. Attacker gains are also cumulative. This is one of the effects that Jervis tells us about. When offensive dominance is present in the offense-defense balance, gains are going to just accumulate. The more you conquer, the easier it's going to be. We can see this with cyberspace. If you conquer one of the domains, it's going to be easier to conquer one of the others. If you compromise the information layer, there's a higher likelihood that you can conquer the human element. Also, what compounds this, and we saw this with zero-day exploits in the video, right? States don't know about many of these vulnerabilities until they're actually exploited or attacked. It's a surprise. You don't know until the day that it happens that you have a vulnerability in your network. And so because of the relative ease of attack, states have to spend much more on effective defenses than they would on offense. So how does this break down? Right? Let's think about it in terms of the security dilemma. We have two states, State A and State B. State A is concerned with their own network security, but they don't know the capabilities or intentions of State B. So they're going to intrude into State B's network to get information on these things. Well, what happens is that State B detects the intrusion, but because we can't tell the difference between weapons, they don't know whether it's an offensive or a defensive operation. What makes this worse are these zero-day exploits, these vulnerabilities that are unknown until they're attacked. This shows the massive cost-effectiveness of offense and surprise attack. So this generates an intense fear in State B. So what do? Well, for defensive purposes, they hack back at State A. They need to see the full extent of State A's cyber power and look at their battle plans. Are more cyber attacks coming? Well, this leads State A to experience the exact same fears that State B experienced in steps 2 and 3. And so what happens is State A starts the process all over again. And the two states get locked in this hacking spiral of escalation, escalating attacks, escalating intrusions, to the point where the probability that traditional warfare means are on the table becomes much higher. There's a very real concern about spillover into the regular domains of warfare. And very quickly, let's just think about this in terms of a prisoner's dilemma, right? Let's say we've got China and the United States. China's extremely concerned about their own network security. They don't want to be attacked and don't want to be exploited with that sucker's payoff, so they defect. Remember, that's the dominant strategy in the prisoner's dilemma, defect. However, when they hack into the United States system, the sucker's payoff changes exponentially for the United States because they don't know that they have vulnerabilities until they're actually attacked. Well, if we look from the US point of view as well, they want to do the exact same thing. They want to hack Chinese networks for their own security, whether in response to an intrusion, whether they don't know that it's offensive or defensive, or in the first place for their own security. It's the same logic. There's a fear of exploitation. But the zero-day exploits are also at work here. So we see with zero-day exploits, the sucker's payoff is increased exponentially. Over time, both players are driven to defection. This is the common prisoner's dilemma that we think about, right? But iterated interactions and the increased escalation in cyberspace make both states much worse off than they would have been if they just cooperated and not hacked each other's networks. So the question that's on everybody's mind now is, can states avoid this escalation? Can they avoid this security dilemma dynamic? Well, the security dilemma gives us an important way to think about this, right? It provides these offensive operations like Stuxnet. They're really few and far between. They're rare. It gives us a way to think about, why is this hacking occurring in the way that it's occurring? Why are all these intrusions taking place? And why are things slowly ratcheting up and slowly escalating and tensions are increasing between states over cyberspace? The security dilemma also gives us a reason to be concerned about spillovers into traditional domains of warfare. There's the very real fear that cyber war will become completely unlimited and that kinetic means, or material force, will have to be used for successful attacking and successful conquest to resolve cyber disputes. A really pressing example of this is what's going on with NATO the last couple years. NATO's Article 5. Remember, their Article 5 is collective defense. An attack on one member is an attack on all. The member state has to invoke Article 5. It's not automatic, so states are judicious. It's only been invoked once. The United States invoked it after 9/11. But NATO Article 5 for collective defense, as of 2016, so not that long ago, 2 years ago, it now applies to cyber attacks. What does this mean? Well, in applying this to cyberspace, it means that member states, any member of NATO, can trigger Article 5. They can invoke Article 5 in response to being attacked in cyberspace. The consequence is when Article 5 is invoked, the other NATO allies are required to come to the assistance of the state that's been attacked, just as they would for any regular military attack. Cyber attacks are now treated as military attacks. More importantly, NATO has also said, in response to cyber attacks, okay, we've got Article 5 now applies, but in addition, military options are on the table. Kinetic military strikes, physical strikes, are on the table. If one of our members is attacked in cyberspace, completely digital, through digital means, and they invoke Article 5, we can come back with hard military force. And so we can see this fear is in play with the alliance, with the NATO, right? With the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the NATO alliance. This fear of escalation in cyberspace has led them to change and alter their policy, incorporate cyberspace into Article 5, and kinetic means can be used in response. So is there any hope, right? This has been kind of a depressing lecture. Is there any hope? Well, yes. And actually, NATO is the leader in crafting these cyber norms. NATO has been at the forefront, even though they're still part of this escalatory dynamic in cyberspace. They've been at the forefront of trying to engineer norms and provide guidance to states on behavior in cyberspace, particularly restraint. NATO's been looking to spread the norm of restraint for states in cyberspace. And they've been doing this really through two different ways. After the 2007 Estonia attacks that we talked about, NATO established the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. That's a mouthful, it's easy to remember, just CCDCOE. What this is intended to do is produce policy guidance for member states and for other states at large who are crafting national cybersecurity strategies and incorporate them into larger security strategies, national security strategies. They're trying to provide guidance on what they should look like, what measures should be with these norms of restraint. Moreover, out of the CCDCOE, the Tallinn Manual has been published. And this is essentially coming from the CCDCOE is functioning as a think tank almost for NATO. That what the Tallinn Manual attempts to do is apply just war doctrine to cyberspace. It's sort of the wild, wild west in cyberspace right now, is what NATO is saying. And we see this with the escalation in the cybersecurity dilemma. Well, with this escalation, to avoid this wild, wild west where everyone has their own weapons and it's a free-for-all, well, we should try and make some rules of the road. And one of the important ones, ironically, that NATO attempts to spread is proportionality. You have to respond in proportion to a cyber attack. Military means are on the table, but you shouldn't necessarily use those all of the time. Maybe just respond back with a cyber attack. So there is some hope for breaking out of this cybersecurity dilemma. We've got norms that might help restrain state behavior and ameliorate this cybersecurity dilemma. So, what questions do you guys have before we wrap up? The security dilemma should be ingrained in all of our memories by now, and it was a long time ago, but it's a really useful tool for thinking about conflict between states and cyberspace. Okay, good. Well, let's sum up and let's look forward. So just, what have we gone through today? Well, we've talked about what cyberspace is and really how this challenges traditional IR theory and our ideas about power, our ideas about vulnerability, strength. As a result, though, we've also talked about how these technical realities of cyberspace, it really empowers non-state actors. Non-state actors become much more impactful on the international stage. But states and the military, they still remain the most important actors, the ones that can do the most damage in cyberspace. Shutting down the Estonian internet for a while is not the same as destroying an Iranian nuclear reactor. The difference there is state-level capabilities. We've also looked at the security dilemma. It's an interesting way to conceptualize this cyber conflict and why states are really doing these low-level intrusions. It's for defensive purposes, but also helps us think about why things are slowly escalating over time. And it provides us with the concern that, oh wow, hopefully things don't, we need to be considerate. We need to think about how this might get out of hand and produce traditional warfare. But the development of cyber norms, particularly NATO is one of the norm entrepreneurs in this regard, think about how this gives us hope of avoiding unintended conflict. So, it's not all bad. IR scholars have a lot of way to go. It's an issue that I think is going to be with us for quite some time, and it needs to be thought about. So, if there aren't any more questions, that's what I've got for you guys. Next week, back to Professor McDowell. We'll be talking about the future of IR, and really this was a nice little preview of what the future of IR might look like. So, Professor McDowell, unless you have anything else, everybody have a good day.